Dear listeners, this episode with the fantastic Thomas is full of wonderful gems, but we had some minor audio issues where it appears as if we jump in mid-conversation. Fear not, there was not a lot that you missed. We do apologize for it both to Thomas and to you. Thomas was a great guest, and you will thoroughly enjoy this episode, and we will have him back on the show in the future to make it up both to him and to you. And now, to this week's episode. Enjoy. Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation.
To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Emmer Sadat. Join me and my co-host, Ace Deliri, as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
So, welcome to Risky Conversations. Please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Virgil Den, or at least that's my pen name. Some of you may know me by my real world name, Thomas Messina. I am a compliance officer at a large financial institution, and on a quarterly basis, I not only attend the Real World Institute, but I also instruct a session on compliance and fraud risk. $1,000, where they were doing exactly what you're saying, and it doesn't take long to weed out these types of compliance officers. You typically see it at the smaller broker dealers, money service businesses, and things like that. At the larger institutions, not so much. Okay. But there is a gray area. I mean, it's not always black and white. Take for example, you might have a politically exposed person, say maybe a former member of parliament who had some negative news that you find out about them. And the question is, okay, should you onboard this particular individual? Sometimes the negative news is simply a blog posting. Sometimes it's in the mainstream press. Sometimes it's just allegations. And so there are some gray areas. And as a compliance officer, you often you put your reputation on the line. Every email I send, any conversation that I have with bankers or senior management, where it's minuted, that a regulator through discovery or law enforcement, they can pull up those records. So you try to be smart about the decisions you make. What you often see are compliance officers that take a very conservative look on things, whereby they will, anytime they're asked for their opinion, they'll always take the most conservative route, which isn't always the best. So you really have to be smart about, what you're doing as a compliance officer, knowing that there are some tremendous downsides. There's a new law in New York. The New York State Department of Financial Services issued an anti-money laundering rule a couple of years ago, and requires a certification from a senior officer at the institution. And this is one of the first times that an individual has to sign their name to a certification, basically saying we're in compliance with the law. And that has raised a lot of concerns about liability. And so compliance officers, some cases, have to get separate insurance in the event there's litigation.
I see. So the question I have to ask you on that front is a compliance officer more like a lawyer or more like an accountant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say it's more like a lawyer. Okay. You're often writing policy. You have to be very careful what you write and how it could be interpreted. There are some, though, in the compliance space that are more like accountants. So you have to think of compliance as not just advisory or policy. There's also an operational aspect to it. So I'm not sure if listeners know that every transaction at a bank is surveilled from a money laundering perspective, from a sanctions perspective. And there are individuals that need to look at any type of alert that is raised from this transactional scanning. So you have an operational component to it where somebody's looking at something. Does it look suspicious? If it's potentially suspicious, it needs to be escalated. So there are sort of kind of the accountant types within compliance. They don't typically get paid as much because they're not taking as much.
So just for our listeners to have sort of an idea, what's the typical salary range for a compliance officer? How do you attract talent, and what kind of money is Wall Street paying for this?
Yeah. So probably over the last maybe 15 years, salaries maybe have doubled or tripled. So the accountant types, they are not making as much. Their jobs tend to be in lower cost centers, whether in the U.S. or abroad. But for the more lawyer types that are in New York or in a major money center, a senior person can make between, salary-wise, $200,000 to $500,000. The head of AML or compliance could make upwards of $1 million. Think about your Citibanks, your JP Morgans. Their head of financial crime compliance easily are making $1 million in salary, maybe another $1 million in bonus. So there's a lot of risk involved in it. And think about a bank that a regulator comes in, finds some issues. Fines are upwards of $1 billion, $2 billion. So
not Trump change.
No. I mean, Westpac, which is one of the largest banks in Australia, was recently in the press. They had 23 million violations of law, each law carrying a potential penalty of $17 to $21 million. Wow. If you do the math, it's like $300 trillion penalty that they could have. So obviously that won't happen, but they'll probably get a $2 to $3 billion fine. So it's pretty significant. Yeah, I've written about this, though. So, these penalties have to be significant, because if they're not, they'll just be part of doing business.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're making, HSBC, I think at one point had a cross-border business with Mexico where they were making, in Wells Fargo too, they made $4 billion in business. And so if you're fined $500 million and you've got maybe another $1 million for remediation, for consultants, you got to hire new staff, you're still probably making $1 billion. And so, I hate to say it, but that's often factored into, whether or not you take on a client. It shouldn't be, but that's why you're seeing the fines get higher and higher. Sanctions violations are the highest. I think BNP Paribas was fined by the Department of Justice, something along the lines of $10 billion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But, it was egregious. They were, in policy, I think it was BNP, or it could be Credit Agricole, one of the French banks. They had basically codified rules to circumvent sanctions, U.S. sanctions. So basically a wire would come in, they'd strip the wire information that talked about Iran, and then they would send it back out so it could circumvent these your sanctions. So they were pretty egregious. I think they even it was a special product that they were offering to some of their clients. It was called like OFAC free or something.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Big business.
So the question is this then: so if you look at this process and you're a bank that gets sanctioned for this particular type of transaction, shouldn't the regulator be like, okay, well, since you've been in violation of this, you are prohibited from engaging in activities with this particular country, for example, just because we know that you're finding loopholes, because we can detect that you don't have integrity. So we're not only going to fine you, we're also going to prevent you from doing business on that front for a 5-year probation or a 10-year probation. Because if you really want to put a check and balance against that, a fine, as you said, if the math is right, you could say, okay, even if you fine me $5 billion and I made $7 billion, I'm still okay. I'm $2 billion ahead, right? And then there's that question. And there's the other question of like, are the laws internationally governed? Because the rules that may be applied to the United States may not be applicable in Russia or China or Kuwait. So how do y'all figure out what is considered a fine or a penalty versus what is just normal business, depending on the culture that you're dealing with?
Yeah. There's a couple questions there. The first one is really about, how do you dissuade, this from happening again at a particular institution? And you're absolutely right. Regulators, can penalize an institution by basically saying no mergers or acquisitions for the next 3 years. There's been all sorts of things, or if you want to divest a particular business, they won't allow it. I think, though, what would really discourage this type of activity is if somebody went to jail, right? It would be that simple. You had one banker that went to jail for one of these violations, and it would change everything. Now, granted, you've had senior executives who have been penalized in that they can't work in the industry anymore. Westpac, again, the CEO is resigned. The chairman of the board is resigning. But to date, there really hasn't been an individual who's going to jail. And I think until that happens, you'll see repeat offenders. The second part of your question was about, U.S. law, international law, regulatory arbitrage, right? Each jurisdiction having somewhat different AML laws and businesses taking advantage of it. And that happens. But what we've been seeing over the last maybe 5 to 10 years is that many countries' AML regimes are pretty robust. There's an international organization called the Financial Action Task Force, and so basically every major country has a representative on that body, except for maybe Vanuatu, I think. But they basically set a global standard, and most countries have implemented policies, laws and regulations that are pretty robust. So the question now becomes, I think, one of enforcement, where the U.S. has been very good at enforcing its AML laws. Other countries haven't. But we're seeing a trend where there's greater enforcement. So the FATF actually comes in and does evaluations periodically of jurisdictions on how their, what their laws and regulations are, and are they enforcing it? And that has really pushed countries to start enforcing it. So the U.S. for many years was the only country that would issue monetary penalties, but now you're seeing, in the EU, it's happening a lot. ING Bank, by the Dutch regulator, was fined $900 million. Commonwealth Bank of Australia, $700 million. So you're starting to see it. And, the EU was a particular weak area, something called the Russian laundromat, where oligarchs and criminals from Russia were laundering their money through Baltic banks, and all these are big name banks. These weren't just rinky-dinky banks. And what the EU has recognized is that each one of their member states are enforcing their AML regulations differently, and so there's now a push to have whether or not this is a good idea is up for debate. Sort of a central EU regulator for AML matters. So that's been in the press a lot. So countries. No country wants to be known as the country that has let child exploitation to happen through their banks, terrorist financing, and things like that. Gray area is sanctions, because U.S. sanctions are sort of extraterritorial in the sense that the U.S. kind of exerts its laws and regulations globally. If you're a sovereign country, you don't really want to listen to the U.S. because you have your own laws and regulations, and the financial institutions in your country need to follow U.S. laws because you got to clear U.S. dollars. You've got customers in the U.S. and things like that, and so the U.S. kind of pushes its laws. Tax evasion as well is a big one in the U.S. The U.S. A couple of years ago went out to Switzerland and fined every bank in Switzerland and made them come to an agreement where there would be transparency into, tax matters. And other countries are jumping on board too, because there's a lot of revenue that's lost through tax evasion.
Right.
And so, they see it as a way to, increase revenue. So,
Right.
yeah, money laundering, anti-terrorist financing, again, tax evasion, stuff like that. It's not going away, and enforcement is getting greater and greater.
Right. So can I ask you for a quick side favor?
Sure.
If you don't mind, just turn off your video because the Wi-Fi connection that's coming through is a little bit distorted. So if
Sure.
we go straight audio, it should hopefully increase the quality of the content that's coming through.
All
So
right.
we'll edit this part out. Don't worry about it.
How's that?
Much better. Much
Okay.
better. Okay, perfect. Sorry. So we're just going to carry on.
So now I can drink my coffee.
You can drink your coffee in peace.
So I was just going to ask, what are the techniques that compliance guys use to manage risk?
You know what? It's a lot of it's just common sense. I talked earlier about you have bankers who want to onboard customers that have sketchy backgrounds, and not being independent and not being pressured by the business is really important. And there are cases, and where individuals have kind of crumbled under the pressure of business people. It's a really big concern, but if you have to think about, you're protecting the institution, you are protecting the financial system by keeping this money out of the markets, and as an individual, you have your own standards of ethics, and I think things have changed whereas in the past, compliance officers probably weren't top notch. They reported to, I don't know, internal audit or something, or even within the business. But now AML compliance officers have to be independent. They report to the risk function that reports directly to the CEO, or in many cases, the chief compliance officer reports directly to the CEO. So things have changed over probably the last 10 years.
Okay.
Okay. So did you always work in this field, or did you just transition into this from some other field?
Yeah, I actually was a computer programmer, believe it or not. I worked for a technology company back in the .com boom, and I left that boutique firm and moved to one of the big consultancies, and it was right around 9/11 and right after 9/11, and there was a lot of work, but the big firms were going in and selling policy, like, we'll help you fix your policies and your procedures. And I think there's an opportunity here where, technology, particularly data analytics, where we can offer clients things beyond just policy. So I built up a team of analysts that would go in, do data analysis. We source the transaction records. We'd look for potentially suspicious activity. We would build little bespoke applications to, screen individuals. And so it was a great time. And just by virtue of doing work for clients, I picked up the laws and the regs. And there was a time where I said, do I want to be a partner or not? And there's big investment as a partner in terms of your quality of life and things like that. And I decided, I think my wife had said to me, because I was on the road a lot, she said, I didn't marry you not to see you. And I was I got to be a partner, and this is what we have to do. These are the sacrifices you have to make. And at some point, I took a step back and I said, you know what, this just isn't worth it. So went into industry and were a big bank for a number of years in their AML compliance and for another bank today.
Oh, it's actually a trend that's more pronounced these days than it used to be, that people do want life-work balance, so to speak. They don't want to be putting in 100 hours a week and not seeing their kids or their wife. So totally understandable on that front. So question is this: what do you teach at the Real World Risk Institute? What do you bring to the table there?
Compliance and fraud risk. So I have probably an hour-and-a-half session at every Real World Risk Institute where we talk about compliance risk, fraud risk, various topologies. We look at the structure of banks and to see are they vulnerable to systemic risk. Not so much from like the financial crisis, but more from an operational perspective. What if the SWIFT network, which connects banks and allows banks to send messages, to transact, do all sorts of things, not just banks, but central banks too. What if that were to go down? How would that affect banks? Because you've had hackers actually hack into that network. So we talk about stuff like that. We have some really smart people in the room. The attendees, some of them come from banking backgrounds, other come from technology. So it's a really good session about financial services, systemic risk, skin in the game. So I've been probably 7 or 8 I've done so far.
Awesome. And we just wanted to give a teaser to our listeners who may be considering attending, and they're just curious as to what it is you're offering when your session comes up. So that's awesome. The question I have for you.
You might get some tips on how to launder money.
Well, that's the thing. That's exactly where I was naturally going next, because my question was going to be, I'm sure there's a threshold of a certain amount of money that has to be moved from one spot to the next before it gets flagged, because you clearly can't watch everything. You'd have to obviously employ some sort of subsampling thing. Yep. So the question we naturally have is, what's that threshold before you become noticeable on the radar?
Well, here's a real well-known one. In the U.S. there's a reporting threshold of $10,000 or more.
Is that real? I always thought that was a myth.
No, it's real. It's real. It's a currency transaction report that needs to be filed to the IRS. And what you find is that there are individuals or entities that make deposits right below that amount, and trying to circumvent that reporting threshold. And so it's called structuring in the industry. They're structuring their deposits to evade that threshold. So that's a good one, but everybody knows about it. So if you were to do it now, you most likely will get caught. But there's all sorts of, you can kind of Google AML and fraud or topologies. You had some really slick ones. Deutsche Bank was fined $1 billion because they were facilitating FX payments, not through funds transfer. So, you have to, that FX is considered high risk in the AML space. And so there's all sorts of rules monitoring transactions. But what Deutsche Bank was doing was called mirror trading. Is they were using securities to move, and the sale of securities to move funds across border. And Deutsche Bank didn't have any surveillance of this. It's, billions of dollars moved from Russia to London and then to all sorts of offshore centers from there. So there's, the money launderers are pretty slick. A lot of large criminal cartels have former compliance officers and lawyers on their payroll.
Of course.
So find ways to evade surveillance.
So here's a question for you. How does when the United States says, okay, we're freezing all assets of, President Maduro and his buddies or of these particular people in Russia or Iran, when they say they're freezing assets, what does that actually mean? What is the mechanics of it? Everybody hears that, they think, maybe they just can't access those accounts. But where's all that money or all that stuff? Where does it go? How long do they hold it for? Is there a way for the other people to get it back if they can prove that they were, incorrectly identified as money launderers, or in this case, funds of terrorists? All that stuff. How do they actually go about the mechanics of doing that? What actually happens?
Well, each bank. So we would get, I don't know, some sort of letter from, the various regulator or enforcement agency. And essentially what banks have is they have blocked accounts. They are, the funds are, there's either an operational control that's put in around the account such that, money can't come in or go out. In some cases, the funds are moved from one account to another account. And those accounts have certain controls around them that doesn't allow the funds to transfer in and out. You don't want your, the U.S. government to say, to actually freeze your accounts, because they send it to every financial institution, and every financial institution will freeze those accounts and and it's not just, your DDA accounts, your checking or savings. If you have, a securities account, if you have trust account, if you have, some funds in custody, for example, that's all going to be frozen, and it's not going to be able to move in and out. And those funds, the banks aren't happy about this because it's costly to kind of keep these controls in place. But sometimes those funds stay there for years and years until it's resolved in the courts or something like that. So it happens. It's you don't want to be on the Office of Foreign Asset Control. That's OFAC. They're the ones who issue all the sanctions, terrorist watch lists, and things like that. You don't want to be on one of those lists.
No, not at all. The question is, what if you accidentally end up on one of those? How would a person ever go through the process of trying to clear their name? That seems like a painful legal turmoil process that would last years.
Yeah. I mean, well, your name won't go on the list unless there's a good reason. The issue is that there are names of individuals on the list that, have fairly common names.
Right.
And so, you have people that, they try to, I don't know, go on vacation and leave the country, and they're on these lists, and their names are screened, and, they're hassled. Eventually, they're allowed to go once sort of the false positive, so to speak, is cleared. But it ruins people's lives.
Of course.
I mean, you try to open up a bank account, your name's on one of these lists.
You're not getting anywhere.
No, it's terrible. It's terrible, and it's unfortunate, but it happens.
So given
keep the name off, you can't. It's because if the name is on this watch list, good reason. Your name just happens to be similar to that name. Every time there's a name gets screened, you're going to come up as a match. And, unless that name's removed from the list, which likely it won't be, you're just going to have to deal with it, unfortunately.
I mean, I'd imagine the first thing you could do is just go legally change your name. And in that process, hopefully they thoroughly inspect and see that you're not the guy they think you are. And hopefully it doesn't get screened. But I'm sure somebody's tried something of the sort.
Exactly.
So the next question I have for you is, given what you've just stated, then I imagine cryptocurrencies and all the variations of that must be pretty big in your world, because if you can't legitimately launder money, if there's such a way to put that as an oxymoronic term, you must be able to do so if you could find the right cryptocurrency to buy and sell, no?
Yeah. The challenge with cryptocurrency as a launderer is, now anyway, maybe not 4 or 5 years ago, is you need an on-ramp and an off-ramp, right? You have to take your fiat and you have to buy it. That fiat's coming from a financial institution,
right,
most likely. And if you want to cash out, again, it needs to go to a financial institution. So it's difficult. I mean, money, it can happen. It happens. But if you're a big criminal, if you're a crime syndicate, you're using maybe crypto as part of your money laundering scheme, but you much rather get it through the traditional financial system. Now, I think cryptocurrency as a potential new asset class that really gains footing in the capital markets. There needs to be regulation put around it. There needs to be controls like a bank around who's accessing the crypto. Are they on one of these watch lists? All of the things that you get in a bank. When you have a wallet, those types of controls need to be put in place.
Are they not put in place already, or they're just thinking about putting them in place? Like, what's the state of that?
Well, it depends, right? So there's custodized wallets. So, like, for example, if you go to a crypto exchange and you have your wallet, you transfer, say, 10 Bitcoin from your wallet to a Coinbase, for example. Coinbase basically puts that crypto into a Coinbase wallet and basically just has a registry that says, you own that crypto. And in order to get onto that exchange, they have to do all sorts of screening and stuff like that. But your own wallet, somebody can drop Bitcoin in your wallet if they just have your address. You won't even know who it came from.
Right.
So there needs to be a way that there's more transparency into whose wallets these are and the money transfers. There needs to be anonymity removed. And I know that a lot of crypto purists don't want to hear this, but until there is regulations, until there's controls put in place, crypto is going to be kind of a, second tier asset class.
Right.
But if you think about, what I said earlier about surveillance, about all the transactions that banks surveil, regulators or just governments, they love the idea. They don't like the anonymity. They like the idea that there's an immutable ledger. Every transaction is recorded. They want to circulate. So I think what's going to happen is there will become regulation. There will be transactions that happen over, ledgers, blockchain ledgers, shared ledgers. And I think
of all this stuff is you have, for example, a company like this, like BlackRock, right? They have so much money or so much quote unquote assets under control. I think last time somebody checked, and this is straight from Paul, our friend, he was saying like something like around $500 billion under asset management. They could, if you're trying to regulate somebody like that, and anything that they do can essentially move the markets just on their end. How do we make sure that the size of the growth of the companies that are now participating in the market are properly regulated by the regulators? Because you guys, from the compliance side on your end is one thing, but like the actual government's controls over these particular entities, eventually it's going to cross a threshold where they just simply won't be able to manage it because they will need such a large team just to even investigate it. So how are we, have we made it too big to fail? Because the regulations from what we can see here is that they're so burdensome that entry into the market is almost locked out, and whatever is already in the market is too big to fail. So it's kind of like a double whammy, right?
Yeah, you have these large institutions that have, trillions of dollars of assets under management. I kind of subscribe to Nassim Taleb's idea of, you've got to break these institutions up into smaller ones because you have consolidation risk. You've got all sorts of risk. And, you get centralized like this. Now, there are small, medium-sized market makers, broker-dealers. But, yeah, some of these institutions are just massive. And they've gotten, ironically larger since the financial crisis, which is sort of intuitive. You would have thought that, governments would have learned that the size of an institution, really put, creates this systemic risk. And believe it or not, I've been on a couple of panels in D.C. with Treasury and large financial institutions, and they're certainly aware of this risk. The question is, how do you address it? And, they've tried to, there's liquidity management, there's reserves, there's, resolution planning, like if a bank goes under, how are the assets distributed? But, I think the real answer is you got to break these institutions up into smaller ones. And until you do that, that risk is going to be there. And it's, I think, Paul in particular, he comes from a financial services background. He's certainly aware of it. And that's why you have to buy some deep out of the money puts when the system crashes.
Well, it's kind of funny because if you watch the movie The Big Short, even when you buy the out of the money puts, sometimes they may not be in a position to pay you out of them, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true.
So the question I have for you on this front is how does this work towards the rest of the world where people aren't in the banking system? There's a large chunk of the people who don't have access to financial institutions. How are they being addressed in the sense you could probably, if I was setting up an operation, I'd say, okay, let's just go figure out a way to do this where we don't have to. If they can figure out how to live without really being involved in the banks, maybe we can sort of replicate a similar system where we trade different things that actually equate to money without actually having to carry money. Yeah, there's costs and benefits to everything, but I'm sure if you're going to get really creative and you're a cartel in Mexico and you need to move around billions of dollars, and you realize that the risk you're taking by making any kind of digital transaction, because like you said, any transaction going through a bank is going to be recorded, I would probably look into some R&D, set up a lab in Silicon Valley somewhere and say, let's just figure out a way to transfer wealth without actually being involved in the network of the surveillance that's already available. So maybe move diamonds, maybe move art, maybe move cars. But, those are small things. Is there another venue that you guys are looking at to say, hey, we don't want to keep our eye off this ball just because we're so heavily invested in figuring it out on the digital side? What's happening in the real world side? What if they're moving assets that are a little harder to trace?
Yeah, I mean, trade finance is a big one, right? Where, there's forged invoices and shipping records where, money is laundered, incredible amounts of money is laundered. In some cases, if you open up the shipping containers, there's nothing in it. You're like,
right,
what happened? Or, they ship pencils and they say it's, cars. And,
right.
There's trade finance is huge from a money laundering perspective. You mentioned a few other ones. I mean, artwork. There's all sorts of assets that can be used to launder money.
Right.
I think from an unbanked perspective, where there's large numbers of people that can't get bank accounts for one reason or another. They may be in remote locations. They may not have the proper location. I don't know. I think crypto, though, plays a really important role there. Something that that I've been thinking about that Jaffer Ali, you guys know, we've been thinking about. We've actually drafted potential crypto wallet that could solve maybe some of these issues where, we could using crypto, using a crypto wallet, we could reach this unbanked population, but at the same time manage the risks associated with anonymity and things like that. So we actually submitted a patent for a special wallet about 2 or 3 months ago. And we're thinking about kind of how do we monetize it now? Can we build it? But the wallet, it would be decentralized. The wallet would do all your identification and verification and even screening for that matter. And anyone using this wallet in the network would be known and trusted. And so you could transact across geographies. You could you would keep the criminal element out of it because the wallet would be smart. You have the ID and V, you have to screen. And so, yeah, it's something we've thought about. And, banks, they really want to tap into this population. Again, though, it's difficult. Think about it. It's high volume, low margin. So you have to, how do you reach them? You can't open a branch unless you have got a lot of these retail funds out there. Banks are trying to get there, but I think really the way to tap that market is through crypto.
So the argument I'd present to you on this front is like I see the legitimate case that you're making for people who may not have access to the financial institutions that the rest of us take for granted. But there's also the other side of the equation of like people in Venezuela or North Korea or Iran or Russia. They just want to not be associated with the state's malfeasance of their economy, and they want to try to attempt to salvage some of their life savings. And if you make that required identity, it may give the state some leverage to pressure those people to giving up their assets, right? So how do you protect their needs? And I'm not saying this is what your product is trying to address. I'm saying how do you, as a person who's in the space of regulations and keeping track of how these things, how do you see that problem? What's your take on that front?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think the answer there is, and it's probably not the answer you want to hear but that's why, high net worth individuals, that's why entities move their funds to the U.S. so that it's out of reach of their local, country's regime, whether it be, Venezuela or what have you. States are going to be states, and there's always that risk, and there's a flight of assets to lower risk jurisdictions, right? It used to be a flight to, offshore money centers where there was anonymity, but that's all been lost. Every financial, you can't go to Cayman anymore. They've got fantastic AML regulations. You can't go even like the Cook Islands now, a place where people used to park, their assets to evade, taxation. That's been opened up. So you can't get around taxation. If you really are concerned about your assets, you move it to a low risk area. You buy real estate in the U.S. and you park your money there. That's what the Chinese do. That's what the Russians do. You wonder why, you look at real estate, for example, in New York, San Francisco, Vancouver, money centers, you wonder like how can they continue to build all this living space that had, 2-bedroom apartments that are going for $5-6 million, and there's no one in these buildings. Because New York City is the depository trust clearinghouse for real estate. It's you park your money in a condo and you'll leave it there, and it's safe. Relatively safe. The U.S. can always go under, or you've got some risk, but crypto is a potential too. And I like Bitcoin. I like things like that. But if you got $100 billion, or even if you got $1 billion, $500 million, the crypto market, Bitcoin is it's so unstable pricing perspective. And if governments, turn negative on crypto, what is that asset class worth? What happens? So I'm sure these individuals are parking some funds in crypto. I think it's, good to have at least some exposure to it. But if you got billions of dollars, millions of dollars, it's not all in crypto. What does that mean to the average individual in these countries? Have cousins abroad. I don't know what else to say.
Right.
All right. So what happened to the Panama Papers?
That is an interesting case. So Panama was once a place where you could, as a wealthy individual, evade taxes by parking your assets in Panama. So basically, law firms or certain brokers would set up shell companies. They would be the nominee on the shell company, and you would move your assets into that shell company, and banks would do business with the shell company. So you decoupled you from your assets in a way. But there was a major hack at one of the law firms, I forget the name of it, and all the customer records were shared with journalists all around the world, and they were all published. It was an embarrassment. There was all sorts of very celebrities, there was politicians who were trying to evade taxes and parking their money there. And on the heels of that, there was a law passed in the U.S. called the Customer Due Diligence Rule, where now beneficial ownership is required. It used to be, if you went to a bank, you didn't have to disclose, and you owned a company, you didn't have to disclose who was the owner of the company. Now, because of that rule, you have to. So this idea of shell companies, anonymity behind ownership, that's all going away. I mean, think about bearer shares. There's no even such thing as bearer shares. Bearer shares are bearer in name only. They've all been dematerialized. Major custodians manage the registries, and so you may have a bearer share, but the Euroclear knows who's the owner of that share, and if it ever, and they've got the physical certificate in a file cabinet, and if you want to change ownership, you change the registry. So anything bearer has moved. It's much harder to evade taxes today. You're much better off just paying your taxes. Because it's just a matter of time before you will be found out.
Right. So the question is this then now. So as I try to look at the problems of a compliance officer, I would imagine this is the order against which you're working, which is state-sponsored activities. So let's say the Russians or the Chinese or whatever trying to hide particular assets because they're sanctioned. 2 would be criminal cartels. 3 would be the terrorist networks, and 4 would just be tax evaders. Is that sort of the right order, or do I have it backwards?
No, I mean that depends on who you talk to. I mean, terrorist financing is definitely high on the list. In others cases, it's sanctions. You may ask, the IRS would say it's tax evasion, but they're all in the same class. It's hard to give them an order of precedence. But certainly what you said makes sense.
Well, what I would imagine on that front is the terrorists should be number 1 on the list because of what they finance. Because you look at it, I could look at it this way, right? There's 2 ways to look at that problem. The problem 1 is, where's the most amount of money being funneled? Obviously, that could be the state-sponsored activities. Yep. But there's also, where's the most harm being done, which would be the terrorist activities and the drugs. So you kind of have to balance which priorities you want to put in front of the other. And I guess there's no real clear answer depending on who you're asking, like you said, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to a bank, they'd say all of those things are equally important. Each regulator, law enforcement would say, you gotta surveil for this stuff. And it's different. I mean, terrorist financing is low dollar. It's in many cases, think about terrorist financing. It goes from legitimate organizations to illegitimate. You have money that's maybe given by you or me to a charity. Unbeknownst to us, it could be, nefarious charity. You have good money that goes bad, whereas money laundering is the opposite. You have bad money that goes good. So from a surveillance perspective, there's totally different topologies how they're surveilled. And then sanctions is really, every sanctions is there's zero tolerance for error from a sanctions perspective. So if you as a bank allow a payment to go out or come in that is from a sanctioned individual or sanctioned entity, you are now liable. Whereas if I onboard, a politically exposed person who happened to launder money, as long as you identified the activity, you filed a suspicious activity report with your regulator, and you blocked the account, you're fine. You did everything you could. But with sanctions, there's zero tolerance for error. You subject to a $250,000, I think, penalty for each payment you process. And if it shows that your control structure at your institution is just failing, then you can get those. Not only are you paying per incident, but you would also get a monetary penalty and an enforcement action. Again, in the billions of dollars.
Right. So it's interesting because I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a CA. He's a forensic accountant, and what he was talking about is the vast majority of the companies that he is charged to audit because of a sale or whatever the case may be, he constantly brings up control structures. And so I was kind of curious as to what he meant by that. But I would imagine that's not really a problem in a bank, considering that's all they do is manage the inflow and outflow of money. So is it foolish to assume they're good at this, or is it just?
Yeah. Banks are very good at P&L and reconciliations of P&L, right? Aside from that, every other control doesn't really matter. And banks have been forced, kicking and screaming, to put in robust controls around AML. You think about some of the best customers. They were money launderers. They would pay the highest fees.
Just to get their piece.
Yeah, they would take you out to dinner. They would treat you. They'd invite you as a private banker to their kid's wedding, and they'd fly you out there. I mean, they were the best customers from a business perspective. And so think about trying to put controls in here that now would stop that business. So you had a lot of difficulty, and you got to think about it. Compliance is the cost center. Compliance is bringing in revenue to the bank, and so do you want to spend $300 million a year on your compliance function? Not really. And as a compliance officer, it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell. You almost become a victim of your own success. Think about it like this. Say you have a solid anti-money laundering. It's fantastic. You haven't gotten any enforcement actions. Well, every year that goes by, your budget gets cut because you're doing so well. You really need. You're doing great. Not on top of the fact is all these other banks are getting in trouble. And say you're a bank and you have an enforcement action. Now there's a blank check. There's a tremendous investment into your control structure. Billions of dollars are getting pumped into there because they want to get the consent order lifted. So if you're an institution that's doing everything right or has a compliance function, your budget's getting cut. Everybody else is control structure is looking better. So now when the regulators come in, they say, "What? Citibank has such great controls. Why are your controls very manual?" So you sort of, and it's a hard sell. It's like you go to management and you say, "Hey, listen, we're keeping this institution reputation safe and sound. We're avoiding enforcement actions and monetary penalties. Everybody else is getting monetary penalties, but it's you're not going to get more funding for it. It's as a compliance officer, and I hate to say this, I'm sure there's compliance functions that say, you know what, we're better off getting an enforcement action because once we do, at least I can hire people, I can get the funding I need for the right technologies. So it's unfortunate.
No, it sounds to me like it's the old saying, right? You don't get paid for prevention, you only get paid for cure after the fact.
Exactly.
So it seems like the incentive is misaligned here.
Well, you know what? But even from a fraud perspective, there's some incentive, right? So each institution has to have fraud loss provisions. There's $100 million and only 20 million. There was only 20 million in fraud. Well, now that institution can lower its fraud provision. So there is almost an incentive, at least from a fraud perspective, to invest in fraud control. For money laundering control, it's different. People kind of conflate fraud and money laundering. Really different animals. Fraud is very binary. It is or it isn't fraud. Money laundering is a lot of gray area. And so, anti-money laundering programs aren't the most well-funded, at least in the past they weren't. But because of the enforcement actions, a lot of institutions had to improve the program.
Right. So the question is this. So what are the top financial institutions that are stellar when it comes to their record on enforcing all these laws to prevent these particular violations of, basically, for lack of a better term, generally agreed upon ethics of how people should be conducting business? So which banks are doing a great job and which ones need to improve their game?
They've all failed miserably. Every single one of them. There was a time when it was thought that Deutsche Bank had best anti-money laundering program, but they really didn't. They hit it well, and they have one of the worst programs. Arguably, they'd say it's gotten better because of all the enforcement action, but every single bank, including the Vatican Bank, had breakdowns. It's unbelievable how many financial institutions, all the big names, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, JP Morgan, this whole, what was his name? Madoff. They had accounts for that.
Wow.
They got in a lot of trouble for that. So every single one of them. Hopefully, though, that they won't have any new enforcement action in the future.
Right. So here's a question for you. So where does a Ponzi scheme fall in line? Is it laundering? Is it fraud? It's a variation because it looks legit for a number of years until you unravel it, right?
Yeah. Ponzi scheme is it's certainly fraud. It's got a money laundering component to it. And
it's like the mother of all things, all wrapped in one, no?
It is. It's pretty bad, but from a surveillance perspective, you can start picking up on these things. And for institutions that hold accounts for Ponzi schemes, there was some failure at that institution. Either their systems didn't detect it, or they were detected, and compliance raised it, but they were ignored, which happens, right? There's a lot of times where compliance officers raise concerns to the businesses, and they're ignored. Now, hopefully that's changing now because of enforcement actions and things like that. But Ponzi schemes are pretty nasty. But again, it can be detected. You believe it or not, you have a good automated surveillance system and good analysts that are reviewing alerts that come out of that system. You find it. You can detect it.
All right, fair enough. Well, we appreciate your time. I know you were limited to the 1 hour for us. Is there anything else you want to touch on? I know you were pressed for time. We're happy to accommodate if you could stay longer, but we also want to respect your wishes. So is there anything else you want to go over, or we're good?
There's so much I want to talk to you about. I want to talk about coffee. I want to talk about coffee because
yes, please. What's your problem with coffee?
You know what? I don't have a problem with coffee. I love coffee. I'm drinking coffee right now, believe it or not.
Good.
What I don't like about coffee and what I don't like about alcohol is when I feel as though it's controlling me. So when I have to have that cup of coffee every day, or I'm feeling anxious and I need a drink, that's when I say, you know what? I've got to cut back on this. And I go cold turkey. It's not easy.
Right.
But I think that's that's my issue. But I do love coffee. I love it black, and but I like messing around with Trish and the guys. So you'll see me keep tweeting about how much I don't like it. But I like my coffee with some Sambuca and a Zed.
Fair enough. No, see, you know what? I always remember the line from Christopher Hitchens, where he said that use the drink, but don't let the drink use you, right?
Exactly.
So that seems like we're in compliance, to borrow a phrase from your industry, with regards to that, because me and Amber literally have cups of coffee here with us as we were engaging in this conversation with you.
It's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. We appreciate your insights into the fantastic world of financial compliance, because, like I said, all manner of criminal activity has to have a payoff, and that payoff has to go through an institution, which means you're one of the gatekeepers. So thank you for lending us into the process.
And thanks for having me. And you know what? I'd be happy to come on again to talk more about it, or for that matter, pretty much anything.
The door is always open to you. Anytime you want to come back, any topics you want to go over, we're happy to have you.
Yes, and thank you guys. You have a fantastic podcast. I've listened to it before, and it's really quite an honor to have been on it today. So thanks again.
Cheers. Have a great day.
Have a good one.
You too.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any conversation worthy of having will inherently be a risky one.
Thank you for listening. Stay anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition and your own unique way of saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Ember Sadat and Ace Deliri signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.